Hey!
Welcome to the podcast, Coach.
Mike, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Man, I think this is like an annual thing. Every new season that we have, we bring you on just to. It's not a Kevin Sutton update, but kind of is. Plus, sharing our thoughts on the state of maybe not basketball as a whole, but maybe college basketball and coaching and what matters a lot to a lot of our watchers and listeners, viewers, I should say, not watchers. I don't know what that means, but yeah. So I'm glad to have you back on, brother. I mean, uh, you and I have conversations quite frequently, and I think some of the things that we talk about would be good to share and unfold
Yeah,
for everybody.
I totally agree. I always enjoy my conversations with you. I count you as a valued and trusted friend. And anytime that you want me on your show, it's just an honor and privilege to be on your show.
I appreciate it so much, and I feel this. I share those sentiments about you as well, Kevin. I appreciate it. How are you and the family doing? First of all,
My family's doing really really well. My wife Beth works at St. Stephen's, and she's had a very good year this year. And my daughter Riley is a student, a freshman at St. Stephen's, and she's had a heck of a year, doing extremely well academically. Plays two sports, volleyball and basketball. Plays in the band, plays the flute in the band,
nice,
and so she's had a really good year, and so the family is doing really well. Our older son Aaron and oldest daughter Kaylee are both doing wonderfully well, and Isaiah as well. So
awesome. I wouldn't expect anything less than that. Um, so, talking about St. Stephen's, right now that you're there,
yeah.
coaching and kind of taking the lead there of that program on the boys' side, how'd your season unfold this year for you?
Well, Mike, we had a tremendous year. When I took the job at St. Stephen's almost a year ago, I told Peter Kraft, the head of school, that I wanted to build my fourth program. My first one was Montrose Christian. The second one was Bishop McNamara. My third one is Montverde Academy, and now St. Stephen's was going to be my fourth program that I wanted to build. And so this year we had four objectives when I took the job. And that number one objective was when we wanted to win the building. And what do I mean by win the building? My staff and I determined that we wanted to build a culture of work, the value of work, and build a culture of love. So we wanted to be a hardworking team that stayed in the gym and trained, and we did that. And then our second objective was to win the community, the St. Stephen's community. And once school started on August 13th, we made a mission to have a community service project every month. And
Okay.
our first project was the shoe drive. And by August 16th, we had collected over 400 pairs of shoes and sent them
Wow.
to different countries in Africa. And then we had, like I said, a different community service project every month, reading with the Falcons, where we went out and partnered with our lower school and intermediate school and read to the students there. We had the food drive. We had the feed the homeless, all of those different types of community service project, because it's really, really important to our program to live out the Bible passage, Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, as much is expected.
Yep.
So we went over the community. We were everywhere, football games, volleyball games. We were interactive. Several of my student athletes have leadership positions at the school. Freshman class president, freshman class vice president, and homecoming king, and what's going to be homecoming court. So we were totally involved in the school community. So we won that over. That was objective number two. Objective number three was to win the county. Our county is Manatee County.
Mhm.
So once the season started, we wanted to win basketball games and win recognition in the county, in Manatee County. So we certainly did that. We broke the school record for the number one wins in a season. We were 23-6. We won the district championship. We went on to the semifinals of the regionals where we lost by 7 points to a really good First Baptist Academy team. But one of our players injured their knee, ruptured their knee in the first quarter. And then we broke four other school records. Our shooting percentages was at 2 point field goal was 53%. 3 point field goal was 41%. And in front of free throw line, we shot 72%. And then the last record, we broke the most field goals attempted and the most field goals made in the season. So those were just some of the things. And then I was fortunate enough to be FACA Manatee County to a Coach of the Year, and then we
Wow.
also had the Manatee County to a Player of the Year, Gerard Long, who was my lead scorer. And then our last and final objective was to take our program, across the state of Florida, and so we played in the southern part of the state, we played in the west part of the state, and we played in the eastern part of the state, and we played in the north. So our name and is being reputation, excuse me, is being spread across the state of Florida. So those were our four objectives, and so I would say that we laid a strong foundation of who we are, where we are, how we play, and how we carry ourselves in a first class manner. So all of our objectives, that I think we met them all, and so I'm really pleased with the direction of our program.
Well, congratulations on that Coach of the Year honor. I mean,
Thank
it
you.
means a lot, right? It means a lot coming into a program like that first year, trying to navigate through some things, especially when you're the new guy on the block from the coach from in that
Yeah,
district and in that region. People are like, "Who is this guy?" But they already know who you are, so there went that. But
yeah,
you kind of backed up your resume. I think that's
yeah.
probably the biggest thing because you could easily come in as well. It's former college coach.
Mhm,
He built this program, Montrose. He built Montverde to be more of a region, like in that region. People know Montverde
mhm.
all through the country, but they're in Florida, and so you didn't lay an egg, so that was awesome.
Yeah.
Because
No, I
that's
was
what
I was really fortunate. I have a great group of young men that bought into um, the program that we were building, and I say we, and all year long we use plural pronouns, we, us, and our, because it was all of us, and the student athletes the four student athletes that were there, and then the other student athletes that we brought in, all uh, believed in me and our coaching staff, and then they bought into our culture. Okay, and then we were set, and we did some great things, and so the program is on a solid foundation and then on a great trajectory, and for us to continue to sustain the level of success that we had this year.
wonderful. Glad to hear that. Now, your philosophy as a college coach, and then now going back to the high school level, how has that changed? Given this is a new generation since the last time you were coaching in high school.
Mhm.
What's that been like for you? That your philosophy, have you tweaked it? I mean, because I'm sure it stayed the same, the foundation of it, right? But
Yeah.
what's changed somewhat?
Yeah, the foundation will always stay the same because those are my non-negotiables.
Yeah,
Mike, you and I on several different conversations, we talk about emotional intelligence and how important that is. And for me, emotional intelligence is becoming self-aware. And I try to use that as much as I possibly can by understanding who I am. So my non-negotiables will never change. Those are the foundational pieces. If you're looking at using a pyramid as an analogy, those are the building blocks from which I build everything. Um, yes, I've had to continue to evolve, as a coach, mentor, leader. And so this is the reason why the challenge of coming back and taking over a high school program. I knew I was prepared to do this. I knew that all of my experiences had given me an opportunity to refine and define um, what my negotiables were and what my non-negotiables were. So at the core of who I stand for and what I stand for never changes. I'm always going to recruit and have student athletes in my program that are men of character. That's the number one thing. I'm always going to choose character over talent. Number
Yeah.
two, I want people that value education. Now, they don't have to be rocket scientists, but they have to value education, because it's really important, becoming even more important as they grow older. Number three, I look for people that celebrate diversity. At St. Stephen's, it's a diverse community. Peter Kraft has done a tremendous job of continuing to add diversity. And diversity, as you and I both know, isn't always about color.
Yeah.
There's economic diversity. There's intellectual diversity. So
Yeah.
we have to celebrate it all. So I have to have people that celebrate diversity. Number four is I have to have people that are passionate about the game of basketball, because all I do is eat, sleep, drink, think basketball. Because it's the tool by which I build my programs, run my programs, and it's the tool that I've used to create what I call living trophies. So basketball is really, really important. So people have to love the game and have to love to be around the game and want to work at the game constantly. And number five is I have to have big dreamers around me, Mike, because I'm a dreamer, you
Yeah.
know. Um, and so I want people to have multi-dimensional dreams. I want to be around people who have their dreams are so big that they're audacious, and they wake you up at night, and they scare you sometimes, because that's who I am.
Yeah.
That's the type of dreamer that I am. And with that being said, I view myself as a dreamer. I view myself as a dream chaser. And then finally, I view myself as a dream catcher.
Wow.
So those are the five things that I look for in people that I want to be around and have in my program, whether they be coaches and or the student athletes. So my standards, they haven't changed. Even though the young men that are in our program are different than the last ones, young men that I had at Montrose Christian. Excuse me, Montbird. But it's about the delivery. I've had to adjust. I view myself as an educator more than a coach. So there's more teaching than telling.
Yeah.
Uh, Everything is about relationships. People don't mind you being demanding of them. So long as that you are, fair, with your levels of demands, so it's about developing a relationship with them. Um, I've always taken a holistic approach to development, mental, spiritual, intellectual, athletically. So taking a holistic approach to development is something that I've always done and always will do.
Yeah.
Um, and then finally, I really believe that this generation, needs clarity, they need consistency, and they need connection.
Yeah. It's so true what you're saying. I just had a conversation not too long ago, about an hour ago, with somebody about how we live in the world of AI, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic tool, but now it's led us to some degree to see something that is real and then be like, was that real?
Right.
What and social media being what it is for young people, most of it's not real, and that's excluding AI from in the first place, right? Let's just say their friends are trying to be something they're not, or they're trying to be something they're not. So with young people at the high school level, I always say, they're being lied to constantly at every turn, right?
Mhm.
And they're looking for real, authentic relationships and the truth. And I think your philosophy leans towards that.
Yeah.
I think that's what they need. That's really what they need, whether they know it or not, or whether they're willing to admit it or not. They
Yeah,
need.
and you and I both know, you can be demanding without being demeaning.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to develop that relationship and know which student athletes need a hug, which ones you can talk a little bit more stern to, and that takes time, to
Yeah.
build those relationships, those authentic relationships that you're talking about, and but if you have clarity of this is the standard, and this is the expectation, most people will always reach it.
Yeah.
And if you're consistent between your words and your actions, there's consistency between those two, people then they'll believe in you. And then finally, if you take the time to connect with people, and I think this is an area that we all as human beings can need to do is take more time to connect and meet people where they are. And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to, meet people in the gymnasium,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to, meet people in the courtyard. Sometimes you have to meet people, in the classroom. Sometimes you have to meet people in church. Sometimes you have to, meet people in your office, and you just have to meet people where they're ready, and not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically, where they are.
Yeah. No, it's kind of a philosophy that in a like just from a spiritual aspect, right? Like you don't ever force people to do something they don't want to do. You kind of read the room, see where
Mhm.
they're at,
Yeah,
and yeah, especially emotionally, right? Because some people wear their emotions on their sleeves, and that's okay as long as it doesn't lead to anything that's out of pocket or unethical, illegal, immoral, right? So I
correct.
think it's really important, that EQ that we talk about constantly.
Yeah. Hmm.
Now, jumping on to another subject, how did you feel? What were your thoughts on this year's NCAA tournament, and what stood out to you? Because I didn't see so much. I don't know. I guess we're always looking for parity and things of that nature.
Yeah. Hmm.
And given NIL, people stacking teams, transfer portal, all that stuff. What was your take on the tournament this year, and what stood out to you?
Yeah, Mike, I had the opportunity to attend the Florida first round regions of the NCAA's, and what was really interesting as a spectator seeing it from the other side, it was really interesting to see the pageantry of what the NCAA is all about. Because, because the last time that I was involved with the NCAA's, I was at Kansas State, and we went to the Elite Eight, and was one shot away from going to the Final Four, interestingly enough, against Dusty May and his Florida Atlantic team.
Yeah,
So I got to see, all of the fans and the celebration, and we got to see the pomp and circumstances that surround the excitement of March Madness. But the number one thing that stood out to me was that, as always, and I've always believed this as a coach, is that you know uh, guards, win in
yeah,
March. Guard play always wins in March.
yeah,
And you gotta, and it was true, and it was true because I thought that throughout the NCAA tournament, the teams that had the best guard play um, went the furthest.
yeah,
And then secondly, I always believe this: the teams that share the ball, and that defend without fouling, always advance.
yeah,
So if you look at the teams that advanced, they were all, had a positive assist to turnover ratio, and they had a very low, they didn't foul nearly as much as the other teams. Um, and the last thing that was interesting to me is that, like, during the regular season, the gap between the mid major and the high major, you know during the regular season is shrinking. Okay.
yeah,
And there was a lot of parity, but I really believed all year long that Duke, Arizona, um, clearly Michigan. Those were three teams that jumped out at me that looked like Final Four teams.
yeah,
And they, Duke was obviously 1 second away, from being there. And Danny's a heck of a coach, and he knows how to get his team there. But it also takes a little bit of luck from time to time.
yeah,
Um, but that's during the regular season. You see, you saw, the gap between the mid major and high major with doing, is shrinking, do by and large by the transfer portal. But during the NCAA play, it was no more Cinderella teams, and it probably won't be, unless, I mean, now in this NIL transfer portal age, you'll just see the teams that have the most resources continue to, advance.
yeah,
Even though, Kentucky with the largest budget or roster budget, you know, got upset. So
yeah,
those are the biggest thing, and probably the biggest takeaway is that the teams that with identity and continuity, they had an edge, and and that's becoming harder to sustain in today's landscape. But the teams that have an identity, this is what we hang our hat on. This is who we are, and that continuity, whether it be, you know, two or three players or the right player, and you saw Michigan. They just talked about it over and over again that winning was they were all just wanted to win. They just
Yeah.
wanted to win. They didn't care, or so they say. They didn't care about who was the top dog, so long as that they won.
Yeah.
And from night in and night out, I think that was really true. They definitely cared about winning. So
Yeah.
they
And that
they
was
were
a group.
connected.
Yeah, that was a group of a lot of transfers as well. When you
Yeah.
look at it, and portal guys, if you will, right?
Hmm.
And I think Dusty May did a masterful job of bringing them together in a short period of time. Which I
And
mean,
that's the key to how you're going to have to do that. And, how can you get a almost a new team every year,
yeah,
and how can you get them to play together and share the ball?
yeah,
That's always been, a factor in the game, but now you got to do it at a faster rate, and at a faster pace, because just like in COVID, I many college coaches were recruiting players via Zoom, and every one of us told the player on the Zoom, we want you to be an alpha dog. We want you to come in here and be our leading scorer. And we amassed a team of 12 guys being told the same thing, you know. And so they all came and said, "Well, no, coach told me I want to be there." And everybody wanted to shoot every ball. Well, that's very similar to what's going on now, but you just add amounts of money involved. So,
yeah,
in my personal opinion.
yeah. No, you're right. And I think from that perspective, the game has become. We've talked about it for years about transformational coaching, uh, building programs, right? Not just teams.
Hmm.
But it seems like we're going more towards now building teams rather than programs, even at the highest levels with the
Yeah.
blue bloods, all that.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, coach, I would ask you, is the college landscape becoming more transactional than ever?
I mean, it absolutely has. When you introduce money and then introduce the sums of money that are being thrown around now, I don't think it could have done anything but become transactional.
Yeah,
Because if you and then you turn around and look at the portal, and portal's only been open for what, 2 days now, and you got almost 3,000, 3,500 students that are involved. I mean, that are in the portal already, and I was blown away by looking at X and seeing that on the men's and the women's side that multiple teams don't have any team.
on the roster.
They don't have any rosters. I mean, I was looking at another, thing on X where, it was over 15 teams that had at least 7 players or more that are in the portal,
Yeah,
and to me, that's just out of balance. So it's just very, very transactional, very much so, and I also believe that roster turnover every year is just roster management is a year-round process,
yeah,
and it's very difficult, short-term decisions over, long-term development.
yeah,
And went back to what we talked about. It's not just athletic development, but if you don't have a kid for more than 9 months, you're really not going to impact their lives.
yeah,
So the character development piece isn't there. Relationships, are now been replaced by a value exchange.
yeah,
And I wouldn't be surprised, Mike, to see it impacting coaches, when they getting large sums of money to, through NIL, and the mismanagement of it. And
yeah,
you offer a kid a certain amount of money and you don't get a return, nothing, you don't get a return on that investment. That can be problematic when you're talking about the sums of money that you and I know are being thrown around or
yeah,
even being discussed. So, yeah, it's you know, what can you do right now? Is the question. Instead of the question of who can I become in your program? and that's a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and,
I think it's important to, like, the other day there was a college game day, and it was our guy Jay Billis
mhm,
with John Calipari. I don't know if you saw that clip.
mhm, mhm.
And I text Jay afterwards. I was like, "Hey man, you did a masterful job of kind of breaking it down, because he did
Yeah,
in that."
he always does.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
speak to
yeah,
Jay. I speak
yeah.
to Jay often too,
As a,
especially during this time of the year.
the counselor always takes the floor really well, and
Yeah.
he did at that moment. And I think he spoke to a lot of things that we use, or people use terminology like, "Oh, it's not sustainable. It hasn't been sustainable. Things are out of whack." Like you said, there's an imbalance. And so my next question, coach, is about the impact on the careers of coaches, right? Because
Mhm.
the ROI has to be a lot quicker, right? The return has to be
Yeah,
much more
absolutely.
expedient than ever.
Mhm.
And we've seen so many coaches come and go just in this short time, and we're thinking, what? Didn't weren't they just? And then they're there, and then they're gone, and then for whatever reason, right? Because of the ROI, and then specifically the impact on minority coaches. So that's what kind of what I want to get to, coaches. NIL, transfer portal, how's that impacting the careers of coaches, and minority coaches as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, the NIL has just, changed the landscape, dramatically. I first and foremost, I think it's changed the job description of what a coach is. And
Yeah,
coaches now are, fundraisers. They have to manage relationships, so they're relationship managers. They have to manage a roster. It's no longer like, okay, I got a kid who's a rising senior, so I need to bring in a freshman, and then he can back him up, and then when he graduates, the sophomore can take over, and that's not the roster management that's being done now. Because roster management is something that's going on year round.
yeah,
Recruiting is vastly different. I mean, you're talking about, people whose sole job is to keep an eye on what's going on in the transfer portal and or around the leagues, around all the leagues, what kid at different levels, is leading that league in scoring, and or who's the all area team or all league team for a level two to maybe two levels below you or a level below you. So coaches has to do all of that stuff, and in that, um, it takes away from you know their ability to think the game and scheme and continue to grow as the actual coaching of the game, because they gotta do all these other things. So it's less about teaching the game. I feel it's more about managing the ecosystem.
yeah,
And that's why I feel also, you look at the size of the staffs now. There's almost a coach per player, and I'm not sure then, how effective that is. And then also you look at everyone modeling the NBA or European leagues, and the college game, mirroring that. But I just see it's just a lot of things that has changed. The role of the coach. It's really really transactional.
yeah,
And the challenge, if you don't have the resources, it really doesn't matter how good a coach you are.
yeah,
If a person has the ability to have more resources, they're going to have more opportunities and be able to do more things, for you.
yeah,
And then you also asked about how it impacts not just coaches but especially minority coaches. I that is one of my topics, and that I talk about often. Because I really believe that's going to change dramatically. If you look at this hiring cycle, there's a far discrepancy between the number of head coaches that were hired this year that have been minorities. You and I back in 2020 during the pandemic, on my show called the Living Trophy Master Zoom class in 2020. there was a record number of African American and minority coaches that got hired.
Yeah.
Well, 26, but the bigger question is, would they be around in 2025, 2026? And
Yeah.
those numbers are dramatically lower.
Yeah.
And so they don't get it. And I liken that to when Barack Obama won the presidency the first time. He made history, but it wasn't until that he won the second term that he was able to enact policies and make an impact.
Yeah.
So using that comparison, minority coaches were hired in 2020, and the jobs that they were hired to, were great opportunities, but that was making history.
Yeah.
Now in 2026, many of them are no longer head coaches of those schools, and those schools have, those positions have been replaced by non-minorities, so you have uh, many more coaches that are minority coaches that are no longer head coaches, and now many more coaches that are non-minorities that are taking up those spots. And I think that the NIL and transfer portals are going to make it harder for minority coaches, because you know uh, it's not about relationships nearly as much as it used to be, or about having a connection to AAU teams. It's about what is your figure and what is your number.
Yeah.
And so a kid that Kevin Sutton could have known his father or known his uncle or had a great relationship with and watched him grow up, and feel like I can deliver him and he's going to come to us. And if our figure, his figure, his asking price was, a million, and I come in with a million, and then somebody comes in with, 1.5, I think we all know that he's going to go, regardless if, I'm his godfather or not, he's going to end up going for the 1.5 million.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that makes it difficult. I think the minority coaches have a shorter leash, if you will, and it makes it difficult to have success, and certainly sustainable success. The support oftentimes for minority head coaches is less consistent, you know, and I also feel that search firms control the pipelines. I mean, but that
Yeah.
goes right back to you know, looking at this as a business, as a big business, as a major business that it is, and in the business world, they use, headhunters and so, we use search firms, and so they control who can, get up to the proverbial plate, if you will. And, fewer minorities are in those decision-making positions. Many of them aren't offensive coordinators, many aren't defensive coordinators, and I heard that the head coach at High Point, his philosophy is that the offensive coordinator, his sole job is being an offensive coordinator. The
Yeah.
defensive coordinator's job is solely to be the defensive coordinator, and I like that. And the special team coach, but if you're a minority, you don't get to one of those positions, then do you really have an impact on the overall game plan?
Yeah.
And or decision making, and thus being viewed. So if you're just labeled a recruiter, you know, it's not nearly, recruiting has changed dramatically. And how important, is actual, recruiting and what that role looks like, and more roles and are being established in more positions that have more, value and importance, or deemed to have more values. Analytics guys, you know, uh, guys who are controlling the general managers, assistant general managers. These are positions that minorities aren't in right now.
Yeah.
Video coordinators. So I wouldn't be surprised. Mike, to be honest with you, I wouldn't be surprised that you know. Moving forward, if they colleges start to adapt the NBA model or the European professional model, that you have assistant coaches that are quote unquote solely as recruiters, they might as well be just like regional scouts
Yeah.
and be relegated to regions and give them a polo with the school and nice gear, but just go to the high school events and go out there and just and then recruit and then catch up with the team when you catch up with the team,
Yeah.
or don't catch up with the team, you
Yeah.
know. But I wouldn't be surprised. And now you have a front bench and you have a second bench. You know, and
Yeah.
some of these teams got so many people they sit them in the stands during the NCAA games because they can only have two benches. So
What I think is interesting about that, and kind of the my concern with having so many coaches is when there's a coaching change, a lot of lives are impacted, more
no
lives than
question,
normal.
no question.
And
I call March Madness, you know, and twofold, two faced. You know, there's March Madness, and on the flip side, there's March Sadness because everyone's running around to see who's getting what jobs. But what they don't realize is the number of lives that are being impacted and
yeah,
how we're being impacted, and and the assistant coaches. And I really, really can't understand or begin to believe that there's no assistant coaches association like a union that can
yeah,
protect them in any way, shape, or form, especially now, because
yeah,
I think you and I both know that you know uh, when you get an opportunity without without security, that's a dangerous combination.
yeah, yeah. No, you talk about the different things that some coaches are set up for as far as failure. Like,
Yeah,
yeah, we'll give you this position, but are we giving you all the resources? Right? As we talked
right.
about resources, and I think it leads to kind of a mindset too, coach, of like who really has the power, who has the authority. Is it the players?
Mhm.
Is it the head coaches? And so that's kind of like my next thing is question to ask you, coaches: how much authority does a head coach possess nowadays? Like, is he have they been defanged and kind of rendered like, well, you can do this, you can do that, but stay away from that. Like, what does that look like now?
Well, I think that it is more about the levels. You
Mm,
know, Danny Hurley's got power.
yeah,
You know, without question. But he's earned that power, if you
yeah,
will. You know, you know, and I think that more people should study Tommy Emmerich at Harvard, and the impact that he's had and the program that he's built and how he's done it, is in the places that he's done it in at Harvard, and how he's made, Harvard basketball, as a globally recognized brand. But he's also has the Breakfast Club, and he's just doing so many outstanding things. A guy like James Jones at
yeah,
Yale, a tremendous coach, a tremendous leader. Those guys are doing some great things. So, you know, um, when you ask the question about, our coaches, how have authority, hurt the head coach, today, it depends on the level, but it's truly the power structure has shifted. The collectives have power. The agents have a lot of power. Because they have the product, they have the kid,
yeah,
they have control of what everyone wants. Administrations. I mean, you look at LSU's administration. They what they want, they go get.
yeah,
They wanted Lane Kiffin, they went and got him. They wanted Will Wade, they went and got him. And before that, they wanted Kim Mulkey, they went and got her. So administrations have power. Those athletic directors. The athletic administrations. And then players clearly have power. Because they're the product. They have the leverage, they have the mobility.
yeah,
They have all of that. Over because they're making more money than some of the without and making more money than the most of the certainly the assistant coaches,
yeah,
in most cases. So, and head coaches now have to operate like, CEOs, like full fledged, CEOs, managing, shareholders, people that help lead their programs because, now, you know, people that have billions of dollars will lend you millions, and so but those people who have billions of dollars, they have those billions for a reason.
yeah,
They know how to make money, they know how to keep it,
yeah,
so and they know money is power.
Yeah.
So I think that head coaches have to understand all of those type of things and those dynamics. And they have to operate and handle businesses where, they have to manage their staff. Like I was
Yeah.
saying before, they got some of these teams out here have staffs of over, you know, 15 assistants,
Yeah.
or and 5 and 6, GAs, and then under them they got like 10 managers. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I haven't even mentioned the 15 players. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where I think we're talking about the upper echelon, right, of the NCAA, and then we go to mid majors and low majors, D2, NAIA, right? It kind of
Yep.
that's where it becomes more romantic again, where you fall in love with the game all over again because there's not those pressures, there's not the high level of burnout and the incorrect balance. And
Well,
so I
it's,
think,
it, it's everything has a trickle down effect.
yeah,
So what is happening at the high level, if you will, the high major level will trickle down to the mid, and from mid to the low Division 1, and certainly moving on down to Division 2 for him, and all the way through.
yeah,
Eventually into high schools. So now it won't be at the same level at
yeah,
each of those levels, but it'll have a trickle down effect. I mean, you're looking at kids that are in, Division 2 kids, that are going to have opportunities at Division 1 levels.
yeah,
So it's not so much where you start; it's where you finish.
yeah,
And so if a kid goes to, let's just say, an Atlantic Sun team, and is the leading scorer in Atlantic Sun, and league, and ends up being player of the year. Well, now he's going to be able to clearly be able to enhance his stock, if
yeah,
you will,
yeah,
depending on what the needs are at the levels above him. And some of those kids are going from, while out of high school, they went to quote unquote a low Division 1 school and skip all over top of, the mid Division 1 and can move right on up to, high major, depending on what their skill set, depending on the need of the particular high major school, and the value that those high major schools are going to place on that position. So
yeah,
shooting is one of those things.
yeah,
If you shoot 41%, from three, you're gonna look at people are gonna look at you automatically. If you're the leading scorer, on a team that won,
mhm,
okay, and you made first team all league, or you were on the all rookie team, people are definitely going to take a hard look at you at the level above you. And
yeah. I
so
think, yeah,
so now you have Division 1 schools that may be taking Division 2 players, and then Division 2 players,
yeah.
Division 2 programs got to take from what, Division 3, and vice versa. So
I think it becomes kind of like they bring in as a specialist,
yeah.
and the specialist here from this level, that level, and I think the cool part for some of them is like they were under the radar. If you weren't doing your homework,
Mhm.
you wouldn't know about that kid playing at Colorado School of Mines, the
Right.
Division 2, right?
Yeah.
With some of those that the Lone Star, what is it? Well, I forget what league it is, but pretty strong. And
Mhm.
you have kids that didn't initially make Division 1, but have Division 1 bodies, have good grades. They have the game, and so they can come back up. Like you said, it's not where you started; it's where you finish.
Yeah, I
And,
mean, but
and I
also
get,
you also have to factor in, there's always been the international student athletes. They've
yeah,
always been a part, but now more than ever, you can get an international student who's been playing in the system over in Europe and playing against pros, for at a way younger age, and now come over here and play collegiately.
yeah,
Illinois has done a great job. Tommy Lloyd has always done a great job at Gonzaga and at Arizona now, of tapping into those international markets. So that
yeah,
now becomes an even more of a you know a factor that the United States student athletes have to compete with.
Yeah. No, I think from the high school level too, because that's where you're at, right? And we see the high
Yeah.
school kids have these dreams and sometimes delusions, right? But mainly dreams
Yeah.
about playing at the Division 1 level,
Uh,
even at the Division 2, some of them, and they're just realizing now, like, man, if I'm not in the top this or top that, I can't rival a 24-year old and what they bring to the table. That was all, like you said, all conference, things of that nature. So I think that's, like you said, the trickle down effect, really huge, really
Yeah,
big.
I mean, they can still have a great experience. They just have to be more realistic. They have to be more patient. You
Yeah,
know, I have several. We had one senior this past year, and then the nucleus of our team was in the junior class. So six of those juniors are going to be rising seniors. And so I'm talking to their parents constantly, and two sophomores that are really talented. And I'm talking to so they'll all be recruitable athletes. So I'm talking to their parents, constantly about you have to have patience.
yeah,
The portal opened 2 days ago. They're not recruiting those guys that are in the portal, and they'll tell you that.
yeah,
They're not recruiting high school seniors, so they're certainly not looking at high school juniors.
yeah,
I mean, only the true blue bloods like Duke can go out and get a high school players and McDonald's players, and but everybody else is got to be patient, and you're going to have to be really creative.
yeah,
And they have to keep the everything in its proper perspective.
yeah,
The objective is to go to college and have it paid for, and uh, but that doesn't all mean that everybody gets to go play Division 1.
yeah,
You know, you look at Gannon. You think Gannon, would like is going to turn back in their national championship trophy because they're Division 2? No, those kids are going to remember that for the rest of their life. They were the best Division 2 school in the nation, in the country. They're not going to sit there and be like, "Oh, we were just Division 2. That trophy's a little smaller." No. They you know, and kids and parents have to put their egos aside. And where can you go and have a career that you can be proud of when you become 40 years old?
yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's all true, and the quality of the experience, like you talked about, has to be the goal. Free school,
Yes,
the
yes,
experience, all that,
yes, yeah,
super important to kind of key in on those things. And I think that's, like I said, the lower levels. It seems to be more of the where you're finding a purity still
mhm,
in things. Now, I want to ask you, Coach, about we talked about coaches being set up for failure. How do you see that playing out, like in a scenario where we see, say, some coaches are being set up for failure and new opportunities? How does that look like to you? What is the anatomy of being set up for failure as in a new opportunity?
Well, I mean, I think it's about alignment,
Mhm.
and I think it goes back to the EQ,
Mhm.
uh, understanding who you are. I know some guys that really wanted to become, college, head coaches. That was a
Yeah,
goal of theirs, and so subsequently they took some jobs and they became a college head coach. But those jobs were very, very difficult. And what eventually happened is after they went in and cleaned up whatever they had to clean up in order to get the job, the reason why the job was open, whether it be at the time, you know, um, graduation rates, how interesting are we talking about that now? We don't, that doesn't even exist anymore. People don't even talk about kids graduating. But, at one time, the graduation rate was a factor and reason why coaches were, let go.
yeah,
And so uh, but what really happens is a coach can go in there and clean up the graduation rate. A coach can go in there and change the culture. A coach can go in there and do great things and change the image of the program, whether they had a tarnished image or not. And then, but at the end of the day, they'll be let go because they didn't win enough.
yeah,
And so that's why I say some jobs are not designed to be successful. You
Wow.
know, their lack of resources, lack of commitment from the administration. You know, there's a number of different factors. You know,
Yeah.
why certain schools are not successful. And so I say those things are the alignment, the fit. Um, no real NIL infrastructure, you know, to
Yeah.
compete in this NIL world. You know, unrealistic expectations. You know, we deal with those as human beings, but you know, certainly in a competitive environment like college, you know, like coaching, you know, some people have unrealistic expectations without resources, you know,
Yeah.
and back to the point, you know, if I have more money than you or more, not just when I say resources, it's not always financial. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes there's human resources as well that factor in. If I have more resources at my disposal, I'm going to be more successful than you,
For sure.
just plain and simple. And you know, you could probably be a one hellified X and O coach, you know. But if my players are better than yours, then your plays aren't going to be my better players, you
Yeah.
know. And then, you know, poor roster construction, you know, because everyone is in this race of I got to have talent, I got to have talent, I got to have talent, you know. But then they just, you know, look beyond the character piece, you
Yeah.
know. And
Chemistry.
I have been on coaching staffs and on in programs where we have had some incredible talent, absolutely incredible talent. Um, but you know, the character pieces weren't there. You
Yeah.
know, and they just weren't there, and so the level of dysfunction was just it was just incredible. You
Yeah.
know, and when things were going well, they were going well. When the rails came off, the rails came off. You know, because people are in adverse situations. People are always who they say they are. You
Yeah.
know,
They go back to
and
their
so
programming.
yeah,
Yeah.
they do. And then the last thing, you know, in terms of setup for failure, sometimes there's a lack of administrative patience.
Yeah.
You know, in this day and age, you know, coaches' contracts are going to be shorter. They're no longer going to be longer. You
Yeah.
know, what scares me is we model the NBA and the European game so much. Now you're going to have, you know, coaches that could be let go in the middle of the year.
Yeah.
You know, and you just promote someone and to either internally or you go out and get someone who a coach that's been let go last spring and he's available, let him just come on in just like they do in the NBA. That's not good. That's not good. You know, because we're talking about maturity levels that aren't the same. You know,
Continuity.
they're just not the same. So,
Yeah.
um, and I just don't think that you can ask someone to build a championship program without the foundation that isn't stable. And
Yeah.
that's what we were able to do. What we're able to do at St. Stephen's in every program that I've been involved in is just take the time to build a solid foundation
Yeah.
of who we are, what we stand for, and how we're going to carry ourselves in a professional manner. Sacrifice the winning, the games, for
Mhm.
making sure that we win the building, make sure that we win the community, make sure that we win our county, make sure we do all those type of things, and then winning overall is a byproduct of the consistency of how we go about doing our business.
Yeah. No, fantastic, coach. Now, uh, I guess to land this plane, because we've been talking a lot about coaches and how things are a little bit different in the landscape of, say, college sports, right? And how it trickles down. What advice would you give to college coaches or here again aspiring to kind of navigate through this landscape, and then also the minority coaches that feel like not getting a shot? What would you say to them in closing?
Um, I mean, those are great questions as always. I go back to what we talked about in this podcast. Spending time with yourself and learning about who you are, developing your emotional intelligence and becoming really self-aware. I think that's important.
Yeah,
As each people successfully navigate their career, understanding their negotiables, what their non-negotiables are, what they're willing to do, what they're willing not to do. Bigger questions. What are you willing to sacrifice to reach your ultimate goal? Some people are willing to sacrifice family, and some people are willing to sacrifice, watching their children grow up. Some people are willing to sacrifice a lot of different things, and I don't judge that. Not at all. Some people uh, chase their dreams around the world,
Yeah.
and that's so long as you are okay with that, then that's the path that you want to choose. Then I respect that. But my advice is to understand who you are, and the sooner and the quicker that you can understand who you are and develop your negotiables and your non-negotiables. I think that this, every person's on their own path and own trajectory to success after are able to define what that success looks like and what it's supposed to taste like and what it's supposed to smell like and what define what true success is, and that's an individual thing. So my advice is, one, develop your, emotional intelligence. Two, define what success is to you. Number three, is what are you willing to sacrifice? And those are the things that you have to add. Those are three questions I think a person has to ask themselves. And when you do that, and whatever happens after that, then I think that's where the person will be the most content.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I've chose to build something that's lasts. Through culture, through character, and through living trophies. I've been really fortunate in my career to to be in this business for 41 years. Got on my path after I graduated from James Madison University and been on it ever since. This
Yeah.
game of basketball has rewarded me handsomely. I love it. And I tell people all the time, you love it, it'll love you back.
Yeah.
It's taken a young man from Falls Church, Virginia, and from the bottom, if you will, quote unquote,
Yeah.
uh, it's taken me all the way to the top. And I've been real fortunate with that, and I just want to continue to give back to the game. I've asked the Lord a long time ago, um, place me where I can have the most impact,
Yeah.
for your kingdom, and that was the best thing and the best question that I ever asked and the best thing that I ever asked for.
Mhm.
And it has helped me wildly. And it's also enabled me to know what my purpose is.
Yeah. Seek first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. I live by that because that's ultimately what we're trying to do as a believer, man. Like that's the main, keeping the main thing, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and when you're dealing with basketball, it's all about relationships. It's all about people. Because if it's not that, then you're going to be let down. Your heart's going to be broken. Your heart might be broken either way sometimes, right? But
Yeah.
I think you're on a fast track to self destruction if you're not focusing on the right things, like you talked about, the EQ, finding out what true success is. So I appreciate it, Coach. I really do, man. And this time together, it's always fruitful. It's always beneficial, and I can't wait to share this with everybody because I know these nuggets of truth will really be impactful for someone.
Always my pleasure, Mike. I enjoy every time we have a conversation, whether it's through text, through telephone, and/or on
Yeah,
any podcast. I always learn from you, and I know my life has always been impacted by you. So, I really enjoy you having me on.
brother. Appreciate you, and we'll do this again soon.
Fantastic. You be blessed.